G'day all and welcome to Critical Faculty. A few months ago we've debunked the Kalam cosmological argument with Dr. Richard Carrier, and today we're going to be tackling yet another rather intuitive argument for the existence of God, and we're going to delve into the past and the present versions of this particular argument. Please allow me to welcome my friend, Dr. Richard Carrier. Hello, Richard. How's it going?
It's going all right.
Great. Thank you so much for coming back on Critical Faculty to discuss this interesting argument. Before we start, there have been a lot of arguments designed for establishing the existence of God. Obviously, the old philosophers of the old days realized that there is a bit of a situation here, and they wanted to push the envelope and prove God's existence through logic, not just faith. Thomas Aquinas is one of those people. He developed 4 or 5 different points, and the ontological argument was point 5 of the other 4. And we have the Anselm ontological argument. There's always been a push for the intellectual evidence for the existence of God. This one here is quite special because it's, as we spoke about, as sort of before we turn on live, it's quite intuitive. It plays on certain human intuition. If you can tell us about this.
Yeah, right. So the idea, like, as humans, we've evolved, we go around and we learn to discriminate between what is natural and what has intelligence behind it. And if you look at like the studies of like religious psychology and religious sociology, you have things like Guthrie's Faces in the Clouds. Daniel Dennett did a book on the psychology of religion. There's a lot of psychology of religion now that we understand that humans over-detect agency. Like we're built to oversee design in things because it's more dangerous to under-detect than to over-detect. And the classic example, and people probably have heard this analogy a million times, but the classic example is, if you're in the savannah, you hear a rustling of grass behind you. It could be a tiger about to pounce, or it could just be the wind. Now, turning to look doesn't cost you very much, right? So being wrong has a low cost, but if being wrong about thinking that it might be intelligent has a low cost, but just assuming it's the wind and not looking, and then the tiger eats you, like, it's a very high cost to be wrong about that. So we've evolved. Our brain has a lot of mechanisms that oversee design because it's safer to make the mistake in one direction than it is in the other. And this is great for survival purposes, but it's terrible for intelligent design, which is actually an example of how our brains are not intelligently designed, right? Like, this is not an intelligent design. This is an ad hoc design that we just sort of evolved, sort of so heuristic to try and figure out how to get through life. The brain is not intelligently designed. It isn't built to like figure these things out smartly. It's just what's good enough, really, to just get us through the day is basically what we got. And so we do tend to see design in things even when they're not there. And Guthrie's title of his book, Faces in the Clouds, like, you see a cloud and it looks like there's a face, and well, how could that be? That's statistically improbable. It's got to be an actual face, or God must be looking at us through the cloud or something like that. So we oversee design in things. And so there's this intuition idea that the two competing explanations are random chance, which is always like very low probability that these conjunctions would occur, or intelligent design, which would guarantee the result. And so we compare those two probabilities and say, well, it must be intelligent design. And our brains are automatically built to do this, but this is a completely fallacious way to calculate, because in fact, lots of things that look like intelligent design are not. And it's in fact, because there's so much stuff, there's so many things that happen, that the probability of seeing apparent design by accident is actually quite high. Like, we don't appreciate this, but it's actually, we should expect to see random coincidences that are very improbable. We should expect to see them quite a lot. Now, there's a threshold beyond which we shouldn't expect to see those things, but our brains weren't evolved to like figure out where that threshold is, right? And that's a really complicated mathematical thing to try and figure that out. So yeah, so it does feel like you look at something that looks like design and you think like the probability of that happening by accident is so low, it must be fate, or it must be God, or whatever. And so that's the intuition, right? And that's these design arguments all play off of that intuition.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people might have not heard of the word teleological, but it's in plain terms, it's something made with a purpose in mind. It's goal oriented, and the word design captures that, because when you design something, you design it for a certain purpose.
Right. It comes from the Greek. Telos means goal or aim. So teleological means for the reason of that goal. So teleological means that there's some sort of end goal that is someone or something is thinking to achieve and has arranged things to get there. Whereas like blind nature can't have goals per se, right? So like if it's a chance accident, it can't be a goal that it's tending towards. It's just random, right? And so that's where the teleological aspect of it comes from.
Yeah. Now, we can advance this a little bit, because I think it started from the very beginning, even before Thomas Aquinas. But Thomas Aquinas is the one that picked it up and added to his other 4 points, and talked about it. But it's not until the sort of the 17th century, English philosopher by the name of William Paley analyzed the analogy of the watchmaker, the watch. And it was an indigenous or sort of a primitive man walks on the beach or in the forest. It depends on what version of the story you're reading, and finds a watch. He does not understand what is this for or what does it do, but it looks complex enough. It doesn't look like anything else he could see. He could actually say, well, this looks like it's designed for a purpose. But yet, I mean, we're going to probably talk about what the problem is with comparing an apple to a watch. But what do you think of that first stance?
Yeah, that captures the intuition, right? Because it is built for a purpose. And we assume intuitively that only minds have purposes, right? And so there has to have been a mind behind it. And actually, just like you said, it goes before Aquinas. I mean, we have Galen, for instance, famously wrote, on the uses of the parts. On the uses of the parts is this massive multi-volume anatomy of the human body, where he goes like, there's no way this happened by accident. It has to be it's serving these goals too well. These things converge to a purpose so well. It has to be some sort of intelligent design involved. And he even proposed like something, he didn't know about DNA, but he proposed something very similar. His analogy was that in his day, there were these complex puppet theaters, these sort of robotic theaters, that in behind them, where you couldn't see, there was this complex system of ropes and pulleys that you would arrange in a certain way that once you set them going, they would go out through they'd have a whole 5-act play. It'd have actors, puppets come out and perform their roles, and a curtain would come up and go down, and so the whole play would act out because of these hidden sort of system of cogs and wheels. And he proposed that there's some sort of system of these cogs and wheels that are below human visual acuity, like they're too small to see, and that in other words, that they're programmed to unfold. And this is his explanation of the fetus. How do the parts of the fetus know to go where they're going in order to develop into an organism to be born? And his idea was, well, there must be some sort of like clockwork mechanism that's invisible. It's super small because it's so small, and it just plays out. And for him, it's playing out mechanically. And so it's just, the intelligence is just the design of the program. And so for him, that's how he could explain mutations and errors and replication. Is says, God built the program, but then it just runs and it might malfunction. Like something might interfere with it or whatever, and it comes out wrong. And that's not God's fault, because God just built the program. He didn't run it, right? So that's Galen's interpretation and how he explains it, which is actually a more empirical and logical way to try and go about creationism than usually is done today. So that makes sense. But what he didn't know, of course, is natural selection, evolution by natural selection. Now, it was not totally unknown to him. So natural selection theory did exist back then. What they didn't have was evolution. So you combine evolution with natural selection, and you get a very powerful engine. And this has been multiply proved now. This is established science, right? So, I know the young Earth creationists like rail against it, but it's one of the most brilliant scientific achievements is to figure this out. That if you just let the system, the sort of random system run, it ends up becoming more and more complex and design oriented without any intelligent input. And that was the insight they didn't have. But the primitive version of this was the Epicurean and atomist view was that in the beginning there were just all these random animals, like legs coming out of heads and hearts out your toe, and like just the organization was random. And then the combinations that couldn't survive died out, and then the only ones that survived to reproduce are the ones that just happen to have the right arrangement. Now, in their view, there's infinite tries. So in their view, this would work, right? So if you have infinite combinations, then yeah, you're going to end up with like seemingly well-designed, goal-oriented beings simply by random chance, because you've tried infinite times. You've rolled the dice infinite times. Now we know like we're limited, and that's probably not infinite times. It's certainly not on Earth. That didn't happen. So that doesn't really explain evolution on Earth. But that's the Darwin's aspect of it. Was, well, wait a minute. What if you have small changes over time that get selected? Then they can build on each other, so you don't have to have it all happen at once. And so that the actual coincidences are small, and they just accumulate over time. And so that's how you get these things that seem like massive coincidences, but really they've been worked on for billions, many cases billions of years. And so that's where we are in the science on this. But yes, we did find a way to get to these complex, seemingly designed, goal-oriented organisms without any intelligent input. And we've proved in computer models that this works. We've proved in the field that it works. We've proved in evidence through paleographic records and so on that it works. So we know that it works. So we know there's these two explanations that both produce the same result, or can produce the same result. Then you go one step further, and this is the point that I make in my work with Bayesian analysis, is that let's say you have these two hypotheses. All right, let's do this. They also make predictions, right? So like one will predict certain outcomes and the other will predict certain other outcomes. And what are the outcomes that are predicted by the natural selection one? One is there's still gonna be a lot of bad design flaws, like brains that over-detect intelligence, right? There's gonna be a lot of design flaws, like the trachea is in the wrong place. It makes it easier for you to choke. So there's a lot of things that they're poorly designed, but that's what you expect, because it's not going to be perfect design. It's just going to be good enough to beat the other guy. That's all it is, right? Whereas with intelligent design, and I pointed this out in other articles, where you say, like, if your goal was to make a person that you wanted to have be a reliable moral agent, you would make a brain that was invulnerable to injury, that didn't require so much energy and fuel to run, didn't require so much oxygen to run, always worked well, like no insanity, no irrationality, like it would just work the way you want it to work. It would be a good reasoning brain, and it would be reliable all the time. And if you're a god, that's exactly what you could produce. There's not really any good excuse not to do that. Whereas the fact that our brains are kind of messed up, they're like kind of a ad hoc, piled together jumble of things that work more or less poorly or well. That's what we expect without intelligent design. So, and then I'll anticipate the theist will say, well, maybe God had a reason to make our brains badly and make them look exactly like brains that would be produced without a God. And you can say, well, yeah, that's possible, but is that even likely? And do you have any evidence that that's the case? And the answer is no. So the evidence really supports the non-God version of how these things happen.
Yeah. Well, the human's pride has been hit twice, initially with Galileo. Now
Right.
we sort of understand that we were not the center of attention, not the center of God's affection. We were not central to the world, and on the planet is just part of the ensemble of even a bigger existence. And then Immanuel Kant famously said once, there will be never a Newton for a blade of grass. And boy, was he wrong. One of the things, one of the things that was posed, the complexity of biological organism is way too complex and way too varied, and each of the animals or the creatures are there for a reason. The giraffe's tall neck and is to reach the leaves. They're beautiful. They seem to be designed for what they need to do. Then Darwin comes along, and now it's an established science. There's no denying about it, to explain exactly how the parts of the watch. and this is where I need your comments, Richard, here on the difference between a watch and here's this analogy that we're going to be providing. the analogy of a watch and you compare it to a rabbit, where is it an honest analogy? Does it actually fit the criteria?
In a lot of ways, no, because now it's hard in the case of Paley's original argument. He's imagining someone who's never seen a machine before, right? And so, but the thing is that this is an analogy written for an audience who has seen a machine, right? So the audience knows what a watch is. That's the argument only works if you know what a watch is. So you actually have a lot of background evidence about, oh, gears. That's a thing that humans do to make things happen. But there aren't gears in rabbits, right? Right. So clearly something different is going on. There are things like gears in microbes, like when you get down to the microbial level. But this gets to the interesting question, before people get to the design question, they get to the question of, why did God even make germs? Right? Like why the mass biowarfare against his own people? This doesn't make, our viruses also, so you've got bacteria and viruses and parasites. There's no reason for those to exist on intelligent design. That's like an engineer who makes these robots that he wants to work really well, and then he also makes like smaller robots designed to destroy the robots that he made and mess them up. Like this is a crazy person, right? Would do this, but in evolution by natural selection without intelligent design, then we expect all these competing forces trying to explore their niche, and they're at war with each other. Yeah, we're at war with viruses and bacteria and parasites and so on. And when you get to like the microscopic level of, for instance, and we'll probably get to irreducible complexity later, but the idea of you have the E. coli bacterium, highly deadly bacterium, and one of the things that makes it so deadly are the flagella, which are these little snake-like appendages, and there's kind of like a gear thing that makes them spin, that allows them to move around more effectively, which makes them deadlier. And William Behe, of course, gets really big into studying, but these are irreducibly complex. There's no middle stage. That's been refuted. Biochemists have shown that there's tons of middle stages, so his whole idea is bogus. But it seems strange to me that he's going through this big elaborate argument as, the flagellum of the E. coli proves God is an intelligent designer. And you go, but that's a weapon of mass destruction you're describing. You're describing an intelligently engineered feature of this bug specifically meant to kill us, right? If God hadn't added it, it wouldn't be as deadly. So he's here like trying to explain why essentially some sort of Nazi God built the flagella on E. coli. He should be deeply worried about this. Like this suggests that there's some sort of super intelligence trying to kill us with germ warfare. He doesn't see it that way because he's so obsessed with trying to prove the design argument. He doesn't realize.
But you see, he's so busy trying to prove the teleological argument that he leaves the problem of evil to another debate.
Right, exactly. This is the point of it. But it's not another debate, right? Because this relates to the goal, right? So we're talking about teleological design. We're talking what the goal. So if you're going to propose that the bacterial flagellum on the E. coli was intelligently designed, you are saying that God had the deliberate, intentional goal of killing kids, basically killing adults, mostly kids, because kids are more vulnerable to it. That was his goal, and so then they'll immediately sweep that under the rug and forget that they just proved that, and only grab the little piece that they proved, which is it's design, and then they're happy. But they don't look at the whole big picture. It's like, well, if you're going to talk about design based on a goal, you've discovered something much more terrifying than the fact that there is a God building this stuff. Now, of course, this all assumes that their argument works, and their argument doesn't work. Like I said, there's actually staged ways to get to the bacterial flagellum. It's not irreducibly complex. And there has never been proved under peer review ever an irreducibly complex organ in any animal or bacterium. So this is kind of a made-up Christian apologetic. It doesn't exist in science. But even if it did, they aren't even reacting to it the way someone should be reacting to it, which tells you that it's just a device. It's just a lever they want to pull to get the result they want. They're not really interested in the consequences of what they're arguing.
Yeah. Well, as absurd analogies and funny analogies that came on the back of that is the infamous tornado and the Boeing 747 airplane and things like that. And I'm going to pose an idea, and I'd like to get your comment, because I think this is where it fails. It's always a comparison between an inanimate and an animate being. And what they're failing to see is animates or the biological beings are under certain pressure to survive, to perform the 7 features of a living organism. And one of them is survival and adaptation. And therefore, they're dynamic systems. They're systems that adapt and move dynamically. And they have a purpose because they're living beings, and therefore they're trying to survive. And you have the environmental pressures on them interacting, and they are responding to stimuli. That's another feature of a living organism. All of these dynamics that lead to the advancement of living things and the manipulation of resources in life to avoid nihilism is not available to an inanimate object. An inanimate object does not try to survive, does not try to eat, reproduce, and therefore they're not under any condition to. So it's very fallacious analogy for me. It just doesn't even compute.
So for people who don't know, we're talking about like the idea that what if a tornado came into a junkyard and flew away, then it just randomly accidentally produced Boeing 747, right? A fully functional aircraft. And usually, like you're pointing out another really good objection to that. The usual objection people make is that that's not how evolution works. People didn't just pop out of seeds, right? Like we have a long history of gradual development. So it'd be more like a tornado comes in and makes a tiny little piece, and then another tornado comes in and makes another tiny little piece, and then for billions of years, and then you have a 747. So it's not like it's all coming together at once. That's not even what happens. And we know this is a matter of fact. This isn't a theory. We actually can trace the piecemeal development of living organisms throughout history and through their cladistics or their DNA relationships. So we know, like, we can tell that certain bacteria are our cousins. Like, we can actually do the same DNA analysis that catches a criminal, we can do to catch, our distant relatives in the plant kingdom and so on. So we know all that. So we know it doesn't happen that way. So it's not a tornado suddenly creating an instant thing. But the other thing is what you just pointed out, is that Boeing 747s don't reproduce, right? And so that's the first key thing is, if Boeing 747s could make more of themselves, and even if it was deterministic, even if it was mechanically, even if it was intelligently designed that way, even if that was the case, it would still at least be reproducing. And then if you add change, so it reproduces, and then there's errors, any kind of errors, even accidental, not even intelligent changes, just accidental errors. And then what happens is the result is either going to have accidentally an advantage or accidentally a disadvantage, or neither. And obviously the ones with advantages are going to build more, right? And so you add this up over time, and you're going to get more complicated things, right? So
you can actually use this as the analogy of us manufacturing airplanes, and we're trying different combination of different things.
Yeah,
we advance them over time.
We can do it much more quickly, like in a matter of years or decades, because we can do it intelligently. So we can actually look at it and say, oh, okay, here's a better way to build this. We're not just like making random changes to planes and watching which ones crash. We could do that, but if we did do that, like, the design would take millions of years, because if it's going to take a lot longer, you have to kill a lot of test pilots with these random things to finally hit upon them. But no, intelligence is hit upon them much more quickly, and that's what tells you the difference between intelligent design and non-intelligent design is in the animal and plant world and so on. Like, it took millions and billions of years, and that tells you it's not intelligent design. Even human level intelligent design is going to take mere centuries, and obviously godlike intelligent design is going to take years at best, if not microseconds, to solve all of these things. So that we can see in the pattern, that we can see the difference between the expected results is that the animal and plant world clearly is not intelligently designed. It's following the the very slow, excruciating, mass murdering method of natural selection, which is it's doing blindly. It's not doing that intelligently.
Well, one of my struggles is to convince the Middle Eastern Arabic world, because this is going to be translated into Arabic. There will be an Arabic subtitle, and I go on Clubhouse and I debate in Arabic, and they're still under the conviction that the evolution is no longer adhered to in the West. It's fallen. ID design, ID is in its place. All the professors in the world sort of are exiting the evolution realm because it doesn't really work. That is their conviction.
Yeah, yeah. It's so much misinformation out there, and I find generally Islamic creationist texts tend to be like 50 to 80 years behind the times, right? Like, so you find arguments that they're taking very seriously that were debunked like 80 years ago, and that no Western religionist would dare, like they know they'd be embarrassed to even suggest them, because they've been torn apart like horribly, and so they get more and more sophisticated. That's why you get Behe's irreducible complexity, which gets really nitty gritty down to like the atoms in a microorganism, where he's like trying to find something that's harder to debunk. So he's way more sophisticated than the kind of sort of wild old young earth monkey trial stuff that you get in Islamic apologetics. But I think that's because of suppression of information and fascism and oppression and lack of education and poverty that plagues the Islamic world, that they're behind the times and more easily manipulated because of that by elites.
Even creationism has undergone its own evolution, because when it started bluntly in the early 1920s, 1910, it was just a push for, hey, let's teach creationism at least alongside evolution as a competing theory, and that because it didn't cut it, it had to masquerade, because it's no longer the language of the world we live in. It had to go under some pseudo-scientific terms to go, no, hold on a second, we're not talking spiritually here, we're talking science. Apparently there are things that it's almost like Democritus' atom, it's indivisible. As you go back, it's so complex at the very beginning. And Michael B. used the flagellum, I think, bacterial flagellum, the mouse trap, that's another famous analogy, but all of which have been biologists were sitting in front of them and saying, actually they can be reduced. They actually evolved from less complex stuff.
No, that's absolutely true, and a lot of that's online, by the way. So and I realize if a lot of your Arabic speaking audience who don't have access to English, that's a barrier, but if you can, there's talk.origins online, which is probably the most, with the topic we're talking about right now, that is the most important clearinghouse, where it's tons of entries by actual scientists debunking these claims. So any claim you can think of is on there. You can search for it, and you can see what Western scientists actually are saying, what the actual evidence is and stuff. And it's an excellent clearinghouse for debunking certainly young earth creationism and also old earth creationism now. That's why I find creationism in the West is mostly a dead prospect. Like if you see it argued at all, it's argued like in churches at lower levels where
what's the website again, Richard, please? Is it talk?
Say that again.
What's the website again?
It's talk.origins. So you do talk.origins. So talk.origins. If you go to that website, one of the things there is archive. In the archive, there's just a massive, basically, encyclopedia of every argument that's ever been made with scientific responses. And I think that's probably the most important website for that purpose. I would like to see websites like that on other topics, frankly.
There's always a conflation between evolution and biogenesis. There's always, because you speak to a Muslim and you say, okay, well, explain to me how the whole thing began then. And not realizing there are two different disciplines. They might sort of intertwine in certain areas, but it's a different science. And we've got really, really good advancements in that area. A lot of things have been explained away.
Yeah, that's true. And it's a harder one to solve because we don't have access to the original materials, right? So we can only talk about what are the various possible ways that it could have happened. It's very difficult to analyze and figure out what did happen because all the evidence has been erased, right? So it's unlike evolution where we have a lot of surviving evidence. We've got DNA, we've got fossils, and so on. Biogenesis predates all that. It's all been melted away, and we have very little to go by. We have sort of artifacts in DNA and RNA of vaccines. We can kind of use a cladistic sort of DNA family tree analysis to get back at what did the first organisms look like, and that's where you get to the RNA world hypothesis and the PNA world hypothesis and these other. There's a lot of very sophisticated discussions of theories in protobiology, which is the origin of life studies. But yes, it's a different thing because the origin of life obviously can't have been by evolution because evolution by natural selection only operates on things that are already alive, meaning like you notice they reproduce, they make mistakes when they reproduce, they metabolize. So you have to already have something alive for natural selection to non-intelligently engineer it and to make it more complex and more sophisticated. So when you get to the beginning, like you said, well, how does it all start? Well, it didn't start with evolution, obviously. There are some models of chemical evolution that apply, but they're not quite the same thing. And so it's still, even those come down to the question of there has to have been a first self-replicating organism of some kind that arose by chance, like random chance. So you have like the combination of chemicals that just happened. So that does have to be the case. And this is where I think what you find is you have like these attempts to calculate, well, look how improbable it is, and they'll do some number or whatever. Usually that math is terrible. I wrote a peer-reviewed article on how these numbers are always wrong mathematically and factually, but it certainly is going to be a rare event. It requires a highly improbable event. That is absolutely true. All scientists will admit this. But here's the thing: is that if that's the case, so let's say there's two possible worlds, one where God or aliens, I don't know, it doesn't matter, start life, like get it started from the beginning, just do it, intelligently engineer it, and a world where it did arise by random chance, right? So here's the things we know. If it arose by random chance, then it had to be a highly improbable event. And we know from mathematics that highly improbable events are only common when there's massive numbers of tries. So you have to have a very, very old universe. I have to have a very, very large universe, and it has to be filled with a lot of stuff, right? So if it was randomly organized, we should expect to see a vastly old universe of vast size filled with vast quantities of material, and that's what we see, right? So that theory actually predicts these weird observations, whereas none of those things are needed on intelligent design. An intelligent designer does not need 14 billion years to do this. They do not need 30, 70 billion light years of space to do it in. They don't need billions and billions of galaxies, right? So they don't need any of that, but random chance does. So random chance predicts you should see that. So the fact that we see that is evidence for it being random chance and not intelligent design. Intelligent design, it should just be like something more like the book of Genesis, where it just happens. And everything's kind of compact, and the whole universe is inhabitable. But no, that's not what we see. What we see, and another thing is, if it was random chance, what we should expect to see is that most of the universe should be an uninhabitable wasteland, right? So, and 99.999% of the universe is a lethal radiation-filled vacuum. So it's not hospitable to life at all. And then of things that aren't that, 99.99% of it is stars and black holes on which nothing can live. And then what you have left after that is 99.999% of it is dead rocks and stuff where life can't arise. So if you were to walk into a room, average apartment, like let's say the one that's blurred around behind me here, and the only life and the whole thing is totally lethal to life, like everything in it kills life, except for like one tiny thing that's so small that it's below even a microscope to see it. Would you assume that the room was built for that? Or would you assume that that's just an accidental byproduct? It's an accidental byproduct, right? So that's what you expect to see, right? If it's not intelligently designed. Whereas intelligent design is more like what Aristotle imagined, where the whole universe is inhabitable and it's all friendly to life and filled with life. and was so always. Like, it's just, there's never, didn't take billions of years or anything like that. Anyway, so we can look at the predictions and see that the predictions pan out not for intelligent design; they pan out for random chance. But that's the thing that apologetics works by: hiding all the evidence that's against them, cherry picking the evidence that they want, and then pretending the other stuff doesn't exist. But when you take all that other evidence and put it back in, you get the opposite conclusion. And I've shown that this works for every argument. Every argument for God there is that some evidence has been left out, trust me. And when you take that evidence and put it back in, it flips. The argument ends up arguing against the existence of God. And the design argument is no different than that. The biogenesis argument is no different than that.
I'm glad that we segued a little bit into cosmology, because that's going to be the next, as you zoom out the picture. It's funny that life only evolved on Earth, that is 4.5 billion years old, only about 700 million years into the life of the Earth, because the temperature did not allow life. There are certain conditions that need to happen and take place for life to emerge. And if they're designed, you think they will happen regardless. But it seems to follow a certain pattern. But we're talking about a universe that's 13.8 billion years old, and a life that is emerged in a very tiny speck of dust within that universe, the visible universe, because we don't know how the bigger picture even is. It's even probably bigger.
Well, we know for a fact it's at least 70 billion light years big, because we only see, because the universe has only been around 14 billion years, we can only see 14 billion years worth of it. But we can do from the flatness of the universe, we can calculate it. It's at least 70 billion. And some estimates are at least 200 billion or more light years in size. Yeah.
I've seen up to 93 billion is the last number I've checked. So it's vast.
Right.
Yeah. It's vast. And if it's designed, you're right. It should be a suspended Earth in the middle of nowhere that hosts the very thing that God created the whole thing for. Otherwise, it'd be a very wasty sort of God, like all these resources have been put in. There's absolutely nothing here. However, we're going to go into a slightly different argument, and this one plays a little bit more by the rules, according to Sean Carroll, the physicist, when he was chatting with William Lane Craig. Because certain numbers, there are 26. We're talking about the fine-tuning argument, and Richard Swinburne, I think, is one of the advocates of this particular argument. And we've got 26 constants that, if they change by a hair, right or left, there will be no life. And it raises the eyebrow, but is it a good one still?
Yeah. And I've commented on this before, which is that there's a good video where Christopher Hitchens was asked this question in the back of a car, and he talks about how it's a bad argument. He still says it's a bad argument, but he says it is the best one they have. And the reason is because you do at least have to give an answer to it. You do have to answer it. Like, how then is that the case? And there are a variety of different answers. One of the most common is multiverse theory, where you have either there's a God or there's a multiverse. Both predict the result. And so how do you decide between them? We do the same thing. It's like, well, what do they predict? What things do we predict from a God, and what things do we predict from a multiverse? Well, the multiverse predicts all the things we've been talking about, vast age, and all this other stuff. Also, a multiverse predicts certain aspects of physics that have been confirmed in physics. So there's a lot of aspects of multiverse theory that are confirmed in the evidence that is not the case for God, where the evidence goes against actually the God prediction. So that's one thing. And I have an article for people who want to dive into that. I have an article on 6 reasons why the multiverse is more probable than God. You can find that on my blog, richardcarrier.info. That's just my name, .info. You can go there and you can find that. And I go into all the reasons. And there are several reasons. And there are better reasons than we have for believing in God. But there's another problem with this argument. It's a little bigger than that. And I think it's one that gets overlooked too easily. And I wrote an article about this as well. And it's that you're basically talking about 2 different things. So even if there isn't a multiverse, let's just say there's only one. And let's say it was random. Let's say it's just totally random what universe popped out. And let's say let's even agree that there's very, very few things that could have popped out that would have produced life. Like most of the possible things that came out would have been dead worlds. Let's even grant that. We could challenge it, but we don't have to. Let's just say that's the case. All we're saying is just like biogenesis, that was a highly improbable event. You got lucky is the way to put it. We got lucky, essentially. But the thing is, when you talk about, we don't have to get lucky with the God hypothesis, and it's, well, actually you do, because you've got a God in that hypothesis, right? So how freaking lucky do you have to be to get a God, right? So you have to like calculate, like, what is how finely tuned is God? And of course, you look at Swinburne and stuff, and they try to argue that that God is simple, and they come up with these sort of elaborate arguments, but that doesn't work. It doesn't work even for specified complexity, where specified complexity is how many different ways can you arrange a thing, and how specified an arrangement have you selected? And so, like, how complex is it? Like, how complex is it, and how specific is it? And that's specified complexity. And so that's the idea that if you could find specified complexity in biology, then that would be sign of some sort of genetic engineering, some sort of human or alien or divine engineering. Behe's actually right about that. He's only wrong about the fact that he's never found any, right? But if you could find something like that, you'd be right. And here's the thing, like, God is one of the most specified, complex things you can think of, right? If you think of, he's not just mildly smart, he's infinitely smart. He's not just mildly powerful, he's infinitely powerful. He's not just mildly, he's not a wishy-washy moral person. He's a good person, and he's like infinitely good. So he has all these perfections of these attributes, and they're all finely tuned to exact perfection. And there's no reason why that should be the case, right? It says you pick all the gods out of a hat that could conceivably exist, and you get this one. It's highly improbable, right? So like you're looking at two extremely lucky events. You either got super lucky and got this incredibly specific, fortunate, convenient God, or you got this incredibly lucky, fortunate, convenient conjunction of attributes. And so you can't really argue between them based on one that requires more luck than the other. They both require the same amount of luck. So all you've got left is the evidence. So like, based on which one happened, we should be able to see different results. So like a world that arose by random chance should look different than a world that arose from intelligent design. And that gets back to all the things that I've been talking about before. When we go looking for those differences, how should those worlds look different? What we see is exactly what we expect if it was random chance and not a random chance natural event, and not a random chance God event, basically a lucky God scenario. And so I think that's the thing that gets overlooked, is how lucky you have to be to even have a God in the first place.
It looks like Otangelo has just arrived in the chat, but because we've addressed this before, but he's again arguing, can blueprints, computer software, hardware, information transmission systems, energy turbines, molecular machines, robotic productions lines, chemical factories self-assemble? So we did talk about that, but you might want to sort of...
There are, like, we've experimented with self-assembling, basically robots that can replicate themselves. But they do obviously they have to start somewhere, right? Like they don't just assemble out of nothing. And so the starting point is biogenesis. So in the model, there had to be some, and by the way, if it's chance biogenesis, what we should expect is the first living organism has to be extraordinarily simple relative to all present life. And that's the track, that's where things track right now. What we found is that DNA is an evolved attribute. Life started as an RNA world, which is much simpler. And in fact, the evidence is trending towards PNA world. PNA does not even require homochirality. So PNA is like much simpler than RNA, and there are self-replicating PNA organisms, or organisms is the wrong word, self-replicating molecules of PNA that are quite simple relative to what is within the cosmic threshold of what's likely to happen by accident. So yeah, it would have to start super simple and build complexity over time, and that's what we observe to be the case. So the random chance thing fits. Everything else is a question. Once you have the self-replicator, then it's just a question of natural selection after that that builds complexity over time.
This question here is interesting, but I think I might have the answer. I'd like to hear your comment as well, Richard, because it's I've heard it directly from a couple of physicists. the multiverse, the superstring theory, and they go, oh, why'd you call it a theory? According to Popper, it cannot be falsified, and it cannot be tested. So it really does not pass the scientific theory. But I've heard it from a couple of physicists where they said, and I can confirm or disconfirm.
Yeah, it's not really true. They can be falsified. There are specific, well, first of all, like superstring theory and multiverse theory are different things. Superstring theory is a foundation of one form of multiverse theory, which I think is the most probable. But there are other multiverse theories that don't require string theory to be true. One of the most common, of course, is the many worlds hypothesis of quantum mechanics. I agree that the use theory gets misused. I think people are used to the idea that a theory is something that's proven and a hypothesis is something that hasn't yet become a theory. That distinction gets made a lot in the evolution debate. That's not really true in colloquial English, and scientists often fall into colloquial English a lot. So I wouldn't get hung up too much on the theory versus hypothesis thing. The only question is, how much evidence is there for it? How well established is it? There is evidence for multiverse theory. It is just not conclusive evidence. And there are also ways to rule out and thus falsify specific multiverse theories. And there's actual science and work being done to do this. And so to see this stuff, my article on multiverse theory, the 6 reasons multiverse is more likely than God, has some examples of this. But there's a lot, if you just look at the latest, like the last year of multiverse theories in peer-reviewed cosmology journals, and you can see they're talking about, here are the models, here are the ways to test them. And the only barrier is that we don't have access to the things we need to be able to test them yet, because they require like super high energy physics that we're not able to replicate, or they require observations that we're not able to make yet, and so on. So these are falsifiable, and there is evidence for them, but they aren't at the level of a theory in the sense that evolution is a theory. Like evolution is very, very well proven. Multiverse theory just remains a hypothesis, but it is a very good hypothesis, and it has a lot going. It has more for it than God does, basically.
Few physicists have confirmed to me that the use of the word theory or theorem in cosmology is very highly dependent on intact and coherent mathematical models.
Yeah.
And if the mathematical model is intact and it makes sense and it complies, it will be called theory.
Yeah, and that's important in this debate, because usually the argument is that you can't explain that, not you haven't explained that. And these are different arguments. The you can't explain that is a modal argument. Now, a modal argument, unlike most other arguments, a modal argument can be refuted by a mere possibility, right? So if you say you can't do it, all you have to do is show that it's possible you can do it, and you've refuted the argument, because you're saying it's impossible. If you say it's impossible, one example of it being possible is enough to get rid of the argument. But that's different than saying something has happened. Now you're saying that it's probable. So you have to show that it's probable, not merely possible. And so that is the difference between modal arguments and normal established hypothesis arguments. A lot of what cosmology does now, cosmological science does now, is it's completely refuted the modal argument that natural origins are impossible. There's a zillion possible ways that it could happen, and they're well established in the field. What hasn't been done is that none of them have been shown to be probable. But now if you're going to like throw into the mix a God hypothesis, well, now you're competing on the same metrics as those others. The God hypothesis performs very poorly. Like it's one of the worst hypotheses in terms of matching the evidence, predicting the evidence, and being an internally coherent, intelligible theory. So all of the possible theories that are in cosmology now are way more intelligible and way more likely than God hypothesis. But that's not the same thing as saying they've been proven. But we don't have to prove it, right? That's not the point of the argument. Is usually the argument is you can't have it, but we can have it. So now it's just a question of if it's possible, now which is more probable, and that gets us back into discussing what does the evidence fit? Does it fit a chance accident, or does it fit intelligent design? And the evidence just doesn't fit intelligent design.
Unfortunately, Tangela makes very, very large claims, and a lot of them are kind of misinformation. he reckons macroevolution primary speciation has never been demonstrated to be true. So I'm putting a link here by nature.
Yeah, that's not true either. And of course, a lot of these kinds of apologetics play equivocation fallacies. Like I'll bet there's an equivocation fallacy about quote unquote demonstrated, where there's a goalpost fallacy where you're using some sort of bizarre definition of demonstration that is not scientific in order to hyper define what you need to do. Like you need to have a dude sit there and watch it happen. Almost nothing in science works that way.
And their understanding of speciation is actually flawed. They're actually expecting a mosquito to turn into a cow.
You're right. Also that. Yeah. Well, yeah. Once you start interrogating them, then you realize they don't know what they're talking about. But there's tons of evidence of macroevolution. In fact, the weird thing is that making a distinction between macroevolution and microevolution is the thing for which there is no evidence. Like
I agree. It's only time.
There's no intelligible reason why you could have one and not the other. Like it's like the only way you could have microevolution and not macroevolution is if you have some sort of like little devil walking around preventing it, right? Like saying like, oh, that's too much microevolution. That might start to look like macroevolution. Is that kind of thing. And so, yeah, usually it comes to things like, well, you can never just spontaneously evolve a liver. And it's like, well, the liver didn't just spontaneously appear. The liver starts as fat, right? Liver is an evolved, specialized fat cell. It's basically just a clump of fat cells that have evolved specialization over time. It's not like there's suddenly an animal with no liver and it had a kid and the kid had a liver. That's not how livers evolved. What you had is you had clusters of fat cells that do different things. Even in us now, we have white fat and brown fat cells that do different things. And liver evolved from the brown fat cell line. And so livers in animals are just these clusters of increasingly specialized fat cells. And that's it. That's just what a liver is. And it took, millions of years. And we can show it in the DNA record. We can show it in the fossil record. So,
yeah, if there was an equation to explain what microevolution is, it would be evolution plus T. Time. That's what that will do it. But
right. It's that also, but like it's very subjective as to what someone counts as macro, right? And evolution doesn't care about your subjective feelings about what is a macro and what is a micro. It just does things. So it's very arbitrary. It's like you look at like the whale's claw that becomes a whale's fin, like deciding arbitrarily when it's one or the other, that's just you as a human making a judgment call for what you want to call things. In terms of nature, it's just a continuum between a claw and a fin. It's just an objective continuum. There's no essence of like suddenly the essence of the whale changed at this one moment. That those essences don't exist. That's not how it works.
I'll put here a link by nature. That's a very reliable source. And that's the library of knowledge. That's macroevolution examples from primates works.
Talk.origins will have a whole thing on this as well. Several articles, perspectives. I highly recommend it.
Yeah. So back to the cosmological situation here with the fine tuning. One of the things we talked about is that there were 26 constants, which that sort of there are certain numbers, and if you tweak the knobs, life wouldn't exist. Wouldn't that create another problem? I mean, if God is omnipotent and works in mysterious ways and can do things that defies nature and defies everything, he can make things. According to Islamic tradition, he would just utter the word "be" and it will be.
Yeah.
The logos, that's another word for the logos, kind of thing. It's the word of God. He can make it happen. Why does he have to adhere to certain numbers for life to emerge?
Yeah, this is it's a really good argument what you just made, and a lot of people overlook it. The argument very similarly was made by Robert Ingersoll in the late 19th century, and he did the essay about the fabulous carriage, and he says you can see a carriage, it's well designed. But then you find this carriage that's like ridiculous contraption of like hundreds of thousands of intricate pieces, all to do just what a carriage does. And he's like, would you call that intelligently designed, or would you call that really stupidly designed? He's like, that's an idiot design. The sleek carriage that has few parts and does the same things just as well is the intelligently designed one, right? So intelligent engineers don't need corks, right? Like what the hell do you need? all these quarks with all these gluons in this complex quark gluon plasma system just to get a proton and a neutron. And why do you even need protons and neutrons? None of this stuff is necessary, but it is exactly what you expect in a random universe. In a random universe, it should just be a random chaos of jumbled stuff that, because there's so much stuff, it results in highly improbable events being common, because there's so many different combinations, so many ways. And you give it, it's basically like you said, just give it time and everything's going to pop out of that, right? So in an unintelligently designed universe, you should expect it to be highly complex like that. You should expect 26 fundamental constants. And when we talk about these constants, some of these are like the mass of the quark and things like that. But it's better to focus on, and a lot of these things aren't even needed. Like there's a bunch of there's no reason for a W boson and a Z boson when you could have a different interaction, much simpler, that makes this, it's really complicated, and it's pointlessly complicated, right? It's not indication of intelligence. It's actually indication of kind of like dumbness, really. It's not a smart engineering feat. But it looks random. It looks like a bunch of random stuff that just popped out. But if you take the most common one, which is a gravitational constant, and sometimes the mistake is made, they'll compare the gravitational constant with the speed of light. The problem is that when you use natural units, which is Planck length and Planck time, there is no gravitational constant and there is no speed of light. They're all one. They just reduce to one and they just fall out of all equations. The constants just are unit converters. They just convert Planck lengths to human feet or human meters, and feet and meters and seconds are arbitrary human inventions. So to translate one to the other is a arbitrary thing. So like the gravitational constant is really just a human tool to translate natural units into human arbitrary units. And so same with the speed of light. The speed of light is this. Speed of light is one. It's one Planck length and one Planck time, and that's the speed of light, and that's it. The one thing that doesn't do this, which is the alpha constant, which is known as the permittivity constant, which affects basically affects the strength of the electromagnetic field. And this is the one that makes the most importance, where you have gravity, the strength of gravity versus the strength of the electromagnetic field. If the E field is too strong, then it blows everything up. If the gravitation is too strong, it crushes everything. And so that you do have to have this kind of balance in order to have stars and everything else. And so that's the most common one. And the alpha constant is unitless, which is interesting. Strongly suggests that it's a geometric operator, that alpha is some sort, it's like pi. We will probably, I suspect, find that it's going to be some sort of universal, inevitable feature of the geometry of space-time. That's just my own conjecture. But when you see unitless parameters like that, you're usually looking at geometry. And like I said, pi is a good example of that. So anyway, so that's the thing, right? But the thing is like, there are, first of all, infinite number of pairs of these that work, because they just have to be in balance, right? So if you double the gravitational constant and double the alpha constant, well, now you're back in equilibrium, right? So you actually have infinite number of combinations that are life-friendly and infinite number that are not life-friendly. And then, so the argument will go, well, but there's more non-friendly ones. So, okay, now you're in transfinite mathematics and you're trying to divide infinity by infinity. And the statistics gets difficult here. We don't really have math to deal with this. So that's one problem, problem number one. Problem number two is that when you throw them out of equilibrium, either of two things tends to happen. The universe collapses, in which case it just resets and starts over again with new random constants, or it gets runaway expansion and rips apart, and then you get basically another collapse because you have like massive energy densities that result in another Big Bang with another randomization. Now, so imagine you have two dice, you're rolling dice, two six-sided dice, you can get 2 to 12 as your result. But imagine that every time you don't roll a 7, the dice get destroyed and you have to roll them again. And then you act surprised that the only result you ever end up with is 7, right? It's like, because all the other numbers required you to keep re-rolling until you got 7, right? And so fine-tuning runs into this problem too, is that it bases this idea that, well, it's all or nothing, but actually that's not the case. There actually could be a ton of these results might be eliminated by the fact that the result results in a reset and a re-roll. right? And so we can't rule that out either. We can't rule out multiverse theory either. And so the exact combination thing just doesn't really get us a confident result of intelligent design. And gods don't need these things. Gods don't need gravitational constants. They don't need alpha constants. Like I wrote in my article on that, perhaps we'll link in the discussion later, but God can just make things fall, right? He can just make things stick together, like you said, right? Like he doesn't need constants. They don't need to be finely tuned. However, do you know what universes have to be finely tuned? Godless universes. The only possible universe, the only possible godless universe a living observer could ever find themselves in is one that's finely tuned. 100%. There's 0% chance that you'll find yourself in any other universe. So observing fine tuning doesn't tell you that you're not in a godless universe, because that's exactly the only kind of universe you could be in. Whereas a God-based universe doesn't need fine tuning. So the probability of being in a non-fine tuned universe is actually non-zero, and probably quite high if there was a
and that term fine tuned then sort of ceased to make any sense, because what you're looking at is a randomization of numbers, and you end up with a certain set that allows life.
Yeah,
and that's what it is.
And you will always observe that, right? Whether God exists or not. So it can never be evidence for God. That's
yeah. Let's point out the elephant in the room, because you and I probably would admit there are a lot of things still we don't know. We're trying to understand the universe. We're trying to understand things. Scientists sort of work tirelessly to improve life conditions and understand things better. But the blatant argument from personal incredulity and argument from ignorance, where a certain number of people would go, "Oh, you can't explain that, therefore."
Yeah.
While you and I would go, "I can't explain that. I don't know, but I like to know, and I'm going to try to work hard to understand, and I'm not going to jump into any conclusions until I found out what the story is."
Yeah. It's the same fallacy. That's the same thing. That's like it. If you can't explain it, therefore God did it. That doesn't follow, because it's like, well, you can't explain it either. You're just making stuff up, and making stuff up is not explaining it. Like if we get to make stuff up, I mean, let's talk about the giant turtle we're all flying on the back of. If we just get to make things up without evidence, that's not really a solution to anything. No, if you can't explain something, you are in a state of ignorance, and you should admit that, and then endeavor to find out what the answer is if you can, insofar as you can.
There is a possibility. I mean, do you think there might be still a possibility? Forget about the Abrahamic God, because I think that God is out of the question. It's so fallacious and so problematic. It just is actually breaking the laws of logic, that he just doesn't exist. He cannot exist, because he's combining so many contradictions.
Just another volcano God. Doesn't make any sense. Yeah.
What about the God of Spinoza, who is not a God, who is not really it's more. I always tend to believe that Spinoza was ahead of his time, and did not want to break the news so harshly to humanity that is not prepared to let go of God. So he's given him something.
I get that impression as well. I haven't studied Spinoza enough to be able to even coherently describe what he even imagines God to be, as opposed to just nature, and which is a non-answer, really, in my opinion. So I can't actually comment on Spinoza's God. I say more about like Thomas Paine's God, right?
Okay, it's very similar.
The deist. Well, Thomas Paine's God is a little more active God than it seems Spinoza's God is. Where Thomas Paine's God is like the guy who just sets up the universe and lets it run, and then kicks off and has a beer or something, right? Like, for whatever reason. That's certainly at least a more plausible God than any God that anybody believes in. But it still requires problems, because you say, like, well, this seems like a pretty evil God. Like, he's like, I'm going to set up this universe that's going to lead to the Holocaust. It's like, that's not a nice guy. So, and I'm not going to do anything about it. So it's definitely not an admirable God. So I think that's why nobody believes in this God, because it's not a worshipful God, basically. but also there's still no evidence for it, right? So, and that's why we get to the chance accident thing. Even a deist God is going to make a universe much more compact, much more friendly to life. It's not going to be billions of years old. It's not going to be billions of light years in size. It's not going to take millions and billions of years to develop life. It's not going to be so hostile to life. It's not going to be so full of evil and pointless evil and misery and injustice and stuff like it. So there's like no evidence for it. So you should never believe something for which you have no evidence, right? Like you need evidence for it. And also, I take it a lot as a Cartesian demon. So you're trying to imagine a God who built a universe deliberately to make that universe look exactly like the universe would look if no God built it. And that requires an extremely bizarre, complex set of motives that you're imputing to this God, as well as an extremely complex, bizarre set of abilities of this God. And you're just making them exist for no reason. They're just there for no reason. So this theory suffers tons of problems. It actually creates more problems than it solves. And so that makes it actually a really bad theory scientifically. So I don't find it plausible at all.
This is an interesting comment. What if there is a God but he's a dick?
Yeah, I've written on that a little bit. We'd have more evidence of that, right? Like a dick God would be fucking with us more. Like, you know what I mean? Like, so what you're looking at is more like a Lovecraftian God that just doesn't even care, right? Like sitting in the center of the universe, listening to his flute players, doesn't give a damn, doesn't even pay attention, right? Like that, it would have to be something like that. And then we're back into the Cartesian demon gods. Like, why even believe that God exists? Why believe Azathoth exists? There's no reason to. It doesn't explain anything. So it's just pointless.
Otangelo, probably you know of him. He goes, I'm Derek. He still uses the Shroud of Turin as a. Would you believe this?
Yeah, well, off topic here, but yeah.
It's been debunked a long time ago. Okay, this is the very last segment of the conversation. So, guys, if you have any questions, we've got another probably 10 minutes of that. To just answer some questions within the topic of the fine tuning, the design, so shoot away. And while we're sort of finalizing the conversation here, do you, with the fine tuning, or especially the cosmological one, I think the biological one is done, is finished. The theory of evolution by natural selection is one of the most established scientific theories probably of all time, because of the amount of parallel sciences that actually sort of say, yeah, it is confirmed. You've got genetics, you've got got so many different methods, and highly falsifiable. Just find me a rabbit skeleton in a Precambrian explore. All of that is so convincing, and it's been proved.
We could have confirmed Genesis archaeologically, genetically. We could have, but we didn't. That's not how the evidence went. So.
But this is something I really like about your approach, Richard. Is at the very end of anything, you say, okay, well, you know what? I'm going to be impartial. Give me the two hypotheses you're inferring. I'm going to put them in front of me, and I'm going to look at the data. I'm going to look at what is the status quo, and I'm going to run them by the two hypotheses, and I'm going to see which one will fit the information better. And what was your? What about the Bayesian analysis here? Have you found anything numbers-wise that leads towards the non-existence of God in that sort of analogy?
Oh, that leads towards the non-existence of God? Yeah, most definitely. I've never found anything that supports the existence of God at all. Like every time you dig deeper into a subject, the evidence against God just builds up. You just find more and more in every subject, whether it's consciousness studies, biogenesis studies, it doesn't matter what it is, even morality studies and all of that. And I capsulize all of this in my Bayesian counter-apologetics article, where I do 10 arguments for God, and I show that these are arguments for God that people usually advance, the 10 most common ones, in fact. And they all leave evidence out. And when you put the evidence back in, it flips the other way. And Bayes' theorem allows you to see this, because what Bayes' theorem teaches you to do is to not just look for evidence for your theory. You're not looking for things that fit. because anything could fit. It could fit a bunch of things. What you're looking for is evidence that's less probable on any other theory but yours. And so that's what you need, right? You need evidence, and the more improbable, the stronger the evidence is for your theory. So you need to find this disparity in probabilities. So you have to find, and you can't leave evidence out. You can't put fake evidence in. You got to be honest. You got to look at all the evidence and then do the math, right? Like, what is more probable on this theory? And then you got to take seriously the alternative theory and say, what is probable on that theory? And then you compare those probabilities. And then if you try to, what I call gerrymander your theory to make it fit, you say like, well, okay, it doesn't fit the evidence, so I'm going to like build a bunch of assumptions into my theory that force it to fit the evidence. It's like the idea that God wants the universe to look exactly like a universe without a God in it. You know, like that's a gerrymander, where you're trying to invent a thing to make your theory fit the evidence that it's already failed to fit the evidence. Yeah. But gerrymander is actually, this is the thing that Bayes' theorem teaches you, that mathematically, inevitably, unavoidably, gerrymanders always reduce the probability of your theory. There's no way around it. And if you don't believe me, I demonstrate it. You can go to that article and see that. And this is the common mistake that people make, is this: they think if they can think of anything that's possible, then automatically in their head it's probable, and they can just act like it's a probable thing. And that's not how it works. If you just make stuff up, it has a certain degree of improbability, and that commutes to your conclusion. So the more things you add to try and make your theory fit the evidence, the less probable your theory gets, not the more probable your theory gets. And this is a counterintuitive fact of how evidence works, but it is how evidence works. It's how the logic works. There's no way around it. You can't escape it. But it is common for human intuition to not know this and not operate that way.
Right. I am going to refer you, Tangela, to the library of information in biology that talks about the evolution of reproduction, because sex is just one of the manifestation of the reproduction mechanism. This is not how it started. I think we've addressed this option select. I think we said it's still a theory because it's mathematically coherent.
Yeah, the terminology is used a little differently in cosmology. I'd say just get acquainted with that. And as long as you know what you're saying and what people understand you're saying, then you're okay.
Oh, this one it gets a bit more philosophical. Is everything we're talking about just an illusion, or there's some objective truth?
Well, it depends on what you mean. What do you mean is an illusion? Colors are illusions.
Yeah.
But the frequencies of photons that trigger the cells, that trigger the neurons that generate the colors, aren't illusions, right? So colors are just convenient illusions our brains make up to keep track of complex information, like the vibrations of photons. And so there's tons of illusions in consciousness, but they're useful illusions. They're not just random. They actually correlate more or less to real things outside the brain. I have an article on that as to what does it mean to call consciousness an illusion. You can go look at that, and I talk about illusion studies. But I suspect the questioner is getting deeper than that and saying, like, what if everything is an illusion? Solipsism or something like that. And there's a reason that actually requires a Cartesian demon again, because take solipsism as a perfect case. Solipsism is just Cartesian demon where you're the Cartesian demon and don't know it. Right. So like it's like if everything was just a thought in your head, then you should be able to alter reality at will. Right. Like, so why can't you do that? Like, why is this wall still here? I don't want it there, and it's still there. Like, what's it doing? So you have to come up with an explanation for why the world acts the way it does. And you can come up with a convoluted solipsistic reason. You won't have any evidence for it, and it will make poor predictions and will not be very successful. Or you can come up with physics, and physics will make highly reliable predictions that will be very useful. And the fact that it works so well tells you that you're onto something, whereas solipsism isn't going to get you there. And that's how you know solipsism is false.
What do you think of Nick Bostrom's 1 in 3 chances, 33.33%, that we live in a simulation?
Yeah, his number is too high, way too high.
Too high. But is it still plausible? Would you give it a bit of a...
No, I think it's extremely improbable. And the reason is that no one would make this simulation. So part of, I don't know, people don't know the whole story, but part of Bostrom's argument is that any civilization that survives long enough will eventually convert the entire universe into computer servers, basically, right? Like, so the whole universe is now computers. And so then once you can do that, then you can just create simulated universes. Any species that does that, that's going to use all their server space on games and paradises, all games and paradises. They're not going to make these stupid, miserable, Holocaust repetitions, right? Like, not only is that of no use to them, like he talks about ancestor sims, but those are useless because you don't have the first conditions. You can't recreate what happened. You're just making new universes with miserable things happening in them. And like, what is the point of that? Like, you'd have to be psychopathic, really. So what you require is you need a species that's so sociopathic that they don't care how much misery they cause, just to run these sims on their servers that serve no purpose and teach them nothing, while all their compatriots are complaining about server time that they're wasting on this, that they could be spending on games and paradises, right? So I just don't think it's at all probable.
Couple of counter arguments about that is that's us simulating us in the past, because we were so detached from the past and we were trying to rerun the records so for them to understand, for us in the future to understand.
That's my point, is we don't have the initial conditions, so we can't recreate it. And we can't back create it either because the data is lost, right? So there's no way to do that. There's no way to create a reliable ancestor.
What if the recreation is not recreating the past, is running possible scenarios of how we would have,
super sociopathic, right? No, it's literally like, let's have like 30 million Holocausts, just like who handles it better, right? Like that's evil as hell, right? I just don't see any civilization doing that. And if any would do it, it's going to be extremely rare. And Bostrom's argument requires it to be a common phenomenon. Like, what's going to be most common is games and paradises. We're not in a game and we're not in a paradise, so odds are we're not in a.
I like the one about, one of the counter argument is the amount of energy required to simulate a universe is almost as much energy as in the universe. But they talked about the just-in-time rendering. So as if you're going to a place, it's blurred, and it starts to clear up as you get closer, because this is how the information gets recorded.
It's actually, there's a bigger computer problem with that, which is that it is a law of computation that the simplest computation of a thing is the thing itself. So if you wanted to simulate a universe, it's more efficient to just make a universe. That's it, right? Like so if you want to make a sim of a universe, now you have to have all the data that comprises the universe plus all the data that comprises the computer that's running the universe. So you need more computational resources than the universe itself would have that you're simulating. And so this creates a kind of infinite regress, essentially. That you can never really, like, there's always a limit. Like, every sim is going to be smaller than the information space of the computer running it. So someone said earlier, like, sim within a sim, like sim within a sim within a sim, it's always going to shrink. And which means that none of them are going to be exactly like the other. Right. So like if you have this universe and you turn it into a simulation of this universe, it will never, ever be a simulation of this universe, because it will necessarily have less data space than the original. So you can't ever do that, actually.
Unless the real universe is way, way bigger than the universe we're observing right now.
But then this universe wouldn't be a sim of that one, right? Yeah. You see what I'm saying? Like, you can never do an exact sim of a universe in that universe.
Agreed.
Maybe if you go find another universe that's bigger and then run, you know what I mean? But anyway, if you can do that, why are you even wasting time on sims? But
yeah, I mean, a story like Westworld is sort of probes that idea, and was like an amusement park for the rich of the future. And that will justify cruelty and everything.
The most plausible sim scenario that I've come up with in my head is that this was a game, but the people who played it, the whole civilization, they've all died off, and the computer is just continuing in run mode because it doesn't know any better, and then all of us are just NPCs. Right? And so it's like Dwarf Fortress that just keeps running forever. But the players have been long gone. They've been dead forever, and no one's playing this game anymore.
It'd be funny if my wife finds me continuously running into a wall sometime in the middle of the night. stuck on a fence or something. That'd be fun. Look, it's always fun to have a conversation with you, Dr. Carrier. I mean, we hope that we've explained this argument away.
Yeah.
But do you have any other ideas?
No, I think we've covered it all. And for people who want to explore more, follow the links. On my website, there is a category dropdown. Fine tuning is in there if you want to get in there. I think biogenesis is too. I don't write so much on evolution because that's such a done subject that I don't really need to add. But for people who want to get into that, like I said, talk.origins. It's a place to start.
Thank you so much. They're actually in the description of the video, guys, all the information and how to find Richard, how to find his courses. Richard, do you want to, before you finish, do you want to talk to some of the audience here about the courses you give?
Yeah, I teach quick 1-month courses. They're study at your own pace. There's no like lectures that you have to attend. So it's readings, challenge questions, and then I evaluate your answers to those. But really, the main benefit of them is you get a month of my time. You can ask me all the questions you have on this subject. And these are subjects in which I'm published expert. So I do multiple philosophy and ancient history subjects. So if you go to my website at richardcarrier.info, right at the top, one of the menus is take classes, and it has, see, take classes right there, top center. It'll show you what classes I teach, and they're relatively affordable because they're 1 month long, and they're just basically your attempt to get into a subject in more detail and monopolize some of my time with questions in a bulletin board. And then, of course, all my books, you can get all my books here. I also have book recommendations. So if you look at the top of the page that's up now, there's recommendations in there. I've got recommended readings in philosophy, origins of Christianity, and ancient science, which is another area that I'm a specialist in. And then, of course, books.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Carrier. I guess probably next time we will take another argument and dissect it. But it's a great fun to have that conversation. And I'm just hoping that our audiences sort of do what you're doing, which is basically take the two competing hypotheses and look at the data, the available information, and run them and see. But unfortunately, the biases, which is something that we evolve with, and we have to actually work so hard to get rid of because they're not quite intuitive.
Yeah, don't let anybody snow you. That's the thing. Don't let anybody snow you. Like, fact check things. Make sure what they're saying is correct, and figure out how to even answer that question. How do you know something is correct or not correct? These are crucial. These are crucial skills in this, especially the world where it is today, where there's so much false belief, so much false information. It's an essential skill to be able to sort them out. What is true and what is not.
Well, that's the end of the show today. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next few days.
Bye, y'all.